The Great Salad Oil Swindle of 1963. File number 004. In November of 1963, inspectors from one of America's most trusted financial institutions climbed on top of a giant industrial storage tank at a waterfront facility in Bayonne, New Jersey. They opened the hatch, lowered their measuring tape, and found exactly what they expected to find: oil. They signed their name to a receipt certifying that the tank was full. They did this tank after tank after tank. Hundreds of tanks, tens of millions of dollars in collateral, verified and certified. The receipts went to banks, the banks sent money, and everyone went home happy. But there was just one problem. Below that thin layer of oil at the top, every single tank was full of seawater. This is the story of Anthony Tino De Angelis, Bronx-born butcher's apprentice, two-time federal fraudster, accidental catalyst for one of Warren Buffett's greatest investment moves, and a man who, by any reasonable measure, should not have been trusted to operate a hot dog cart, let alone a financial empire built on borrowed money and literal ocean water. He was 5'5", stocky, wore horn-rimmed glasses, and had the kind of face that made you think of the deli counter, not the boardroom. He was, by all descriptions, completely unassuming, which, as it turns out, is exactly what you want to be when you're running the largest financial fraud in American history. Let's start at the beginning. Tino De Angelis was born in 1915 to Italian immigrant parents in the Bronx, and by his early teens he was already managing a meat and fish market with around 200 employees. He was clearly smart, he was clearly ambitious, and he had instinct, which never really left him, for finding exactly where rules were loosely enforced and exploiting that gap until the whole thing collapsed on everyone around him. His first major opportunity came courtesy of the federal government. In 1946, Congress passed the National School Lunch Act, a program designed primarily to prop up agricultural prices by having the government buy up surplus food and funnel it into school cafeterias. The government, bless his heart, was not especially picky. It would buy practically anything at the right price point, and quality inspections were, let's say, aspirational. Tino noticed this. He took over a meat packing company called Adolph Global in North Bergen, New Jersey, scored a massive government lunch program contract, and then delivered 2 million pounds of uninspected, unusable meat while also overbilling the federal government by $31,000. The company was fined, went bankrupt, and Tino essentially wrote a check and walked away. No prosecution, no prison time, no real consequences at all. Just a lesson that the government, if you move fast enough, was more interested in getting the problem to go away than actually punishing anyone for creating it. A man with better judgment might have taken this as a sign to slow down. Tino took it as a business model. By 1955, Tino had spotted his next opportunity. The US government had launched the Food for Peace program under President Eisenhower, which subsidized the export of surplus American agricultural products, particularly vegetable oils, to post-war Europe. The idea was to stabilize European economies while conveniently clearing out American stockpiles. It was good policy. It was also, if you squinted, a pipeline of government money flowing toward anyone who could plausibly claim to be in the business of exporting food. Tino squinted. He formed the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation and set up shop in a dilapidated tank farm on the Jersey waterfront in Bayonne, New Jersey, a maze of rusting interconnected industrial storage tanks right on the edge of New York Harbor. Allied started legitimately enough, buying vegetable oil, shipping it to Europe, cashing government export subsidies. Tino genuinely became a significant player in the global vegetable oil trade. At his peak, he would later boast, with zero apparent irony, that he was responsible for 68% of all US vegetable oil exports. He called himself the Salad Oil King. The problem was that Tino's ambition was permanently outrunning his actual capital. He was operating on thin margins, taking losses, funding one contract with cash from the next. He needed more money than the business was generating, and he needed it fast. This is where the American Express Field Warehousing Company enters the story. American Express in the early 1960s was primarily known for its traveler's checks, and, more recently, its charge card, a business it had launched in 1958. But it also ran a much less glamorous subsidiary called American Express Field Warehousing, which did something unglamorous but useful. It loaned businesses money against physical inventory. If you had a warehouse full of goods, American Express would inspect the inventory, issue a receipt certifying its value, and that receipt could then be used as collateral to borrow from banks. It was a legitimate and widely used form of commodity financing. Tino became one of American Express Field Warehousing's first and biggest clients. He had tanks full of vegetable oil. American Express would send inspectors. They'd verify the oil was there, they'd issue receipts, and Tino would take those receipts to banks and borrow against them. Perfectly normal. Except Tino started needing more receipts than he had oil. So he solved the problem the way you'd expect a man of Tino's particular talents to solve it. He started filling his tanks with water. Oil floats on water. That's the whole trick. Oil floats, and the inspectors were measuring from the top down. When they climbed to the top of a tank, opened the hatch, and lowered their measuring tape to find the surface of liquid, they found oil. Because there was oil, right there at the top. A thin layer a few feet deep in the tank that might be 40 feet tall. The rest, from the oil surface down to the floor, was seawater. Nobody was diving in to check. The measuring tape hit liquid, the liquid was oil, the inspector signed the receipt, and Tino had collateral for another few $1 million in loans. But Tino, being Tino, did not stop there. He also built metal columns inside some of the tanks, tubes filled with oil, so that if anyone poked around more aggressively, they'd find oil wherever they looked. He ran a secret network of pipes between tanks so that when an inspector arrived, the same oil could be pumped around the facility to appear in multiple places at once. He demanded 24-hour notice before any inspection, which gave his crew time to redistribute whatever oil he actually had. He issued receipts for tanks that didn't exist. He double certified tanks that other companies had already counted. When inspectors came, they were treated to lavish lunches, a generous gesture that had the side effect of shortening inspection time considerably. And here's the detail that should have stopped the whole thing much earlier. The total amount of soybean oil that American Express was certifying on Tino's behalf exceeded at times the entire known soybean oil supply of the United States. Monthly reports from the Department of Agriculture tracked national inventories. If anyone had compared those numbers to Tino's certified holdings, the math would have not worked. There was simply more oil on paper than existed in physical reality in the entire country. But nobody compared the numbers. American Express field warehousing auditors, it turned out, included people with friendly relationships with Tino's operation. Some employees were essentially on his payroll. The oversight function had been hollowed out from the inside. Banks that had received the American Express receipts trusted them because they came from American Express. American Express trusted the receipts because their inspectors signed off. Their inspectors signed off because they were measuring the wrong layer. The whole system ran on institutional trust, and institutional trust, it turns out, is a remarkably poor substitute for actually looking inside the tank. By 1962, Tino decided that running a fraud this large wasn't quite ambitious enough. He would also corner the global soybean oil futures market. Cornering the market means buying so much of a commodity that you control the price. If you own most of the oil and you hold most of the future contracts, you can drive the price up at will, and everyone who sold you contracts at lower price has to settle at whatever price you've pushed it to. It's the kind of trade that, if it works, makes you extraordinarily wealthy in a very short time. It's also the kind of trade that, if it fails, requires you to have actually had the money you claim to have. Tino did not have the money he claimed to have. He was borrowing against fake oil to buy future contracts, using the futures positions to support the borrowing, and using the borrowing money to buy more futures contracts. It was a loop, and it worked beautifully as long as the price of soybean oil kept going up. In the autumn of 1963, the price of soybean oil was, in fact, going up. It climbed from $9.20 per 100 pounds in October to $10.30 by mid-November. Tino was getting close to the corner. The whole audacious structure was almost holding together. And then the US Senate on November 15th broke off negotiations on a Russian wheat deal. This was significant because the deal with the Soviet Union would have created massive export demand for American agricultural products. The anticipation of that deal had been supporting commodity prices across the board. When the Senate walked away, the soybean oil market cracked. Prices dropped. Margin calls went out. Tino's brokers, most prominently a Wall Street firm called Ira Hopton Company, which had been his primary futures broker, suddenly needed him to post tens of millions of dollars in additional margin to cover his positions. Tino did not have tens of millions of dollars. Ira Hopt scrambled. It borrowed $36 million trying to cover Tino's contracts. It wasn't enough. The exchange suspended Hop's trading privileges. A second brokerage, Williston & Bean, was similarly caught in the blast radius, and it was forced to merge into a larger firm just to survive. On November 19, 1963, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil filed for bankruptcy. Tino's creditors, 51 banks, brokerage houses, and trading firms, did what any reasonable person would at this point. They sent inspectors to Bayonne to verify their collateral. The inspectors climbed the tanks, they opened the hatches, they lowered their tapes. They found water. Allied had posted 1.8 billion pounds of soybean oil as collateral. The actual amount of oil in those tanks was approximately 110 million pounds, about 6% of what they claimed. The loans against this phantom inventory totaled over 180 million. In today's terms, that's roughly $2 billion. It was, at the time, the largest financial fraud in American history. The financial damage spread fast. 51 creditors were caught in the collapse. 2 major Wall Street brokerages were destroyed. The New York Stock Exchange, worried about a cascading panic, had to intervene to prevent a broader market crash. American Express's stock dropped more than 50%. The fraud was so large and so connected that it sent shockwaves through the entire financial system. And then, 3 days later, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The Great Salad Oil Swindle, which had been front-page news, the financial story of the year, the kind of scandal that would have been investigated and debated and written about for months, was buried. Immediately, completely, and for a long time. Kennedy's death consumed all available oxygen in America's public life, and a story about vegetable oil and warehouse receipts and a guy in New Jersey with some creative plumbing did not stand a chance. Norm Miller of the Wall Street Journal won the Pulitzer Prize in 1964 for breaking the story. Most Americans have still never heard of it. Tino was arrested, tried, and convicted on charges of fraud and conspiracy. At sentencing, the judge gave what was described as an admiring speech about De Angelis. A self-made man, a hard worker, a sharp businessman. The kind of tribute you'd give at a retirement dinner, which made it slightly strange as the preamble to a prison sentence. Tino was handed a 7-year term. Investigation also revealed that he'd hidden over $500,000 in a Swiss bank account while declaring personal bankruptcy, which resulted in a contempt charge. Millions more in loans simply vanished and were never accounted for. Now here's where the story turns. In the wreckage of the scandal, with the American Express stock down 50% and institutional investors fleeing the name, a 33-year-old investor from Omaha named Warren Buffett started paying very close attention. Buffett knew American Express. He'd been watching it for years. The company's core business, traveler's checks and the charge card, were untouched by the fraud. The field warehousing subsidiary was the problem, not the brand. The question was whether the scandal had damaged American Express's most important asset, its reputation. So Buffett went and checked. He hired a friend named Brandt to conduct what Buffett would later describe as a scuttlebutt research. Brandt interviewed bank tellers, hotel managers, restaurant owners, and cardholders. He produced, and one account describes it, a foot-high stack of material, and the answer across all of it was the same. Business as usual. Travelers were still buying traveler's checks. Diners were still handing over their Amex cards. December 1963, the month after the scandal broke, showed that travelers' check sales up 20% year over year, and the card billings up 44%. Main Street did not know or care about the salad oil situation. Wall Street had panicked and cratered their price. Buffett concluded that these were two different things. By June 1964, with the stock down 43% from its pre-scandal price, Buffett invested $13 million, approximately 40% of his entire partnership's assets, into American Express. It was the most concentrated bet of his career to that point. He bought 5% of the company for $20 million total, valuing the whole business at about $150 million. American Express eventually settled all claims from the scandal for approximately $60 million. Real money, but not fatal money. Within a few years, the stock had recovered and then some. Buffett's position was worth multiples of what he had paid. The investment became one of the foundational examples of his philosophy. Find a great business temporarily wounded by a problem that isn't actually structural. Verify that the wound isn't fatal. Buy as much of it as you can carry. American Express paid around $60 million in settlements, fired up its core businesses, and went on to become one of the most profitable financial brands in history. Berkshire Hathaway still holds more than 20% of the company today, a stake worth tens of billions of dollars. The ripple effects of the swindle outlasted Tino's prison term by decades. The New York Produce Exchange, the primary market for cottonseed and soybean oil futures, which had been at the center of Tino's corner attempt, did not survive the fallout. It was eventually absorbed and dissolved. Field warehousing practices across the industry were overhauled. Commodity lending standards were tightened. The episode became one of the case studies for systemic risk in collateralizing lending. And historians have drawn explicit comparisons between what happened in Bayonne in 1963 and what happened in the mortgage-backed securities market in 2008. The same basic failure mode, scaled up by 40 years and trillions of dollars. And then there's what happened to Tino. He was released from prison in 1972 after serving 7 years. He was 56 years old, essentially bankrupt, owing more than $8 million to the IRS and barred from the commodities industry. He immediately went back to work in the food business. He set up a collection of companies with names like Rex Pork, Miller Pork Packers, Meadow Meats, and This Is Real, Prize Protein Pigs. He didn't own them officially because he couldn't, but everyone in the industry understood who was running the show. By 1975, he was running what investigators described as a Ponzi scheme involving livestock dealers in the Midwest, buying hogs from farmers and suppliers, promising payment and never paying. One livestock dealer in Indianapolis alone was taken for $3.5 million. In 1980, 17 years after the salad oil swindle, 8 years after getting out of prison, Tino De Angelis was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy, and mail fraud, and sentenced to another 7 years. Total estimated take from the meat fraud, $13 million. He was paroled in 1983. The terms of his parole included a specific condition: no direct or indirect financial interest in the pork industry. He immediately went to work in the Finger Lakes region of New York, operating a company called the Natural Lean Pork Company. In 1993, he was 77 years old. Tino pleaded guilty to using $660,000 in forged letters of the credit from the savings bank of the Finger Lakes to purchase over $1 million worth of pork from a Canadian firm. He was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison. At sentencing, Tino offered what had become kind of an inadvertent masterpiece of self-justification. He said, roughly, that during business failures, people are often forced to take measures that they would never have considered under normal conditions. This was his explanation. His get-out-of-jail-free card, deployed in a federal courtroom at age 77 for his fourth or fifth criminal enterprise, depending on how you're counting, was essentially, things got stressful and I did what I had to do. He died on September 26, 2009 in Eustis, Florida. He was 93 years old. Think about the geometry of that life for a moment. He ran the largest financial fraud in American history. He got out, ran a meat fraud, went back to prison. Got out, ran another meat fraud, went back to prison. Got out, ran another fraud, went back to prison. Then he got out one final time and died free, in Florida at 93. He never stopped, never expressed meaningful remorse. And by the most basic actuarial math, he won. He outlived most of his prosecutors, most of his victims, and probably most of the judges who sentenced him. The story of the Great Salad Oil Swindle is usually told as a story about fraud, and it is. But it's also a story about institutional trust and what happens when people responsible for verification have every incentive not to look too hard. American Express was one of the most respected financial names in the world in 1963. Their inspectors certified Tino's phantom inventory not because they were stupid, but because the system rewarded them for processing receipts and punished them for slowing down a valuable client relationship. The same dynamic has appeared in every major financial fraud before and since. The mechanism changes, the incentive structure doesn't. The entire salad oil swindle ran on one physical fact: oil floats on water. A Bronx butcher with a 6th grade education and a measuring tape understood that a multi-billion-dollar financial industry would never look below the surface, and he was right until he wasn't. Warren Buffett, meanwhile, understood something simpler: that the people panicking on Wall Street and the people eating dinner and paying with their Amex cards were not in the same conversation. One was trading headlines, the other was living their actual lives, and the actual lives turned out to matter more. Sometimes the most important thing an investor can do is sit at a restaurant, order something, and watch what happens when the check arrives. Tino De Angelis, the salad oil king, the twice-imprisoned hog fraudster, the man who tried to corner the global soybean market with water, died in a retirement community in Central Florida at the age of 93. His obituary, if there was one, was not in the New York Times. The tanks in Bayonne are gone. The New York Produce Exchange is gone. Ira Hopt and Company is gone. $200 million in phantom oil is, presumably, still missing. But American Express is still here, and if you had a nice dinner recently and paid with the card, somewhere in the ledger of history a small percentage of that transaction traces back to a rusting tank farm on the Jersey Shore, a thin layer of oil on the top of a lot of seawater, and a round-faced man in horn-rimmed glasses who bet everything on the fact that nobody would ever bother to look down.